Hi.
Hey.
Hey, folks. Welcome to another episode of Quarkus Insights with a very special guest today, Sebastian, who hopefully will tell us only why Quarkus is so awesome and won't tell us anything about why he doesn't like Quarkus.
Oh wait, no,
No, I'm just
no. s-
kidding. We want we're expecting from Sebastian some honest feedback about what he likes, what he doesn't like, and hopefully to give us a new, fresh perspective on Quarkus. And today with me again, we have Steve and Max, who are regulars now on the show to like grill Sebastian as much as possible in these 60
Yeah.
minutes that we have.
Yeah.
So, Sebastian, you want to introduce yourself to the folks who perhaps haven't heard of you or what you do or haven't been to
Yeah,
conferences and stuff like that?
absolutely. Yeah. So my name is Sebastian. I'm born and raised in Munich, Germany. I work for this company called IBM, and in general, I do a lot of stuff with, well, Java, enterprise Java, I guess. Have been around for a while for Java EE, then Jakarta EE, microprofile stuff a lot. Do a lot of things with containers and Kubernetes and all of these things, and also with Quarkus. I'm actually a big fan of that for multiple reasons. But especially, I would like to talk about it a little bit from a real world perspective, because I was actually doing some real world projects with it already, and I can maybe share some insights. What I think is kind of cool about it from that view. So, because pretty much everything that I'm doing is always kind of connected to, like a real world. I try to keep keep it real as much as possible. So not just these fancy new hype technologies, but things that people can actually use in day-to-day projects, and yeah, that's what we would cover today.
Yeah,
And
and
some
do like
feature
as we
flags would
talked,
be awesome.
do let us know if there's stuff you think that doesn't work. That's more fun.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's more
I think that's
challenging.
actually first of all, one thing that works pretty well is just the community and the open sourceness in general. Because I had a lot of issues that I just put in as GitHub issue, and then in literally no time, like super fast, I always got a response. Like people were actually very helpful in general to just trying to figure out how to solve certain potential issues, and then actually provide pull requests. And also because it just moves so fast, right? So chances are, if you actually submit something that then gets fixed, that you can actually use a new version in a matter of days sometimes. So that's I think
Yeah.
is pretty cool already.
Yeah, we do try and be helpful, and also the one thing we do that's very well, I think the helpfulness we've always done in Red Hat and gave us in the Java space. But what's different in Quark is that we release basically every month, and that means that we can fix things.
Yeah.
It doesn't take multiple months. But yeah, it's also a struggle. There's a lot of GitHub notifications, but
GitHub, email, everything.
yeah, it's all over the place. So yeah, so if anyone listening who wants to help out and give feedback on Stack Overflow and GitHub and respond, like one of the issues we have, I think we plus 1,000 issues now, and that's not because we don't want to fix them. It's just we think a lot of them is actually just not reproducible anymore. So we probably should do like a cleanup day at some point.
Yeah.
But
So how many 1,000 are for Sebastian then? Several hundred by the sound of it.
yeah. We'll see. Hey, go ahead, Sebastian.
Yeah, so actually, one of the things I first wanted to share with folks is the developer productivity or developer experience perspective, right? Because I think this was one of the first things that people really got to see when it came out. Quarkus, this development mode that you can just start up, like Maven, Quarkus Dev, and then pretty much you have this hot reload mechanism, this connection to your source code. You basically change, save, reload all the time, and you have a very short feedback loop, which I think, just to begin with, is cool for a bunch of reasons. Because when you program, when you code, you actually want to stay in this development mode, in your flow, in this flow experience as much as possible. And for that, you actually need fast feedback, right? Because this was what always was pretty annoying with the enterprise space, that if you have these old application servers that just take half an hour to restart, then your flow experience is like zero. You change something and you have to wait 30 minutes. So of course you want that fast feedback. while developing locally. So this is already, pretty cool, but chances are folks have seen that already. So today I want to show this actually with a little bit more of a complex setup, which is something I was also sharing in my on my blog already. So I created some videos on that, how to do what is called a remote dev. So if you check out the Quarkus documentation, you can actually see this, that this dev mode works also remotely, either, like somewhere on a server or whatever you want to connect to, or also remotely, quote unquote, with containers. So you can actually run the whole thing in a Docker container, also locally, and then do the development mode. So why would you do this if it's locally? Well, actually, if you have a more complex setup, which quite quickly actually happens in real world projects, if, for example, you run your application plus a database plus something like an external system, like a backend that you need to connect to, and then it's just much easier or more closer to a production setup if you configure it in the same way. So just as a very short demo that I started up. So what I'm actually running here, you can get the code, of course, in GitHub, is a coffee testing project. So let me quickly show this here, which is, of course, a Maven project with Quarkus. That application is called Coffee Shop, and what I'm running is actually 3 Docker containers. So of course I could just say, Quarkus dev this project and then run it locally. But what I have here is actually 3 containers. The first one, that line here, that's a Coffee Shop project. This one is a database. I'm just running a Postgres, so that's just then easy to set up. And actually, the reason why the whole thing runs as Docker containers is that I have a third one, what I call Barista, which is actually here. You see the wire mark, so it could or could not be an actual backend. So that's not our perspective here. But here you see that you actually locally can run this in Docker containers, which is quite helpful for tests, and still have something like a remote dev mode. So for example, when I have, let me just run this local host. So that's now the Quarkus application, something like a root resource with some hypermedia type links. If you're interested in the project, you can check that out on GitHub, or I was actually talking about it. It's just, about coffee orders. You can do some orders and whatever. But the interesting thing, I think, is that this now runs in a Docker container, but it still has a connection to the development mode. So if I go and, for example, this class, that's the entity builder for this index with links and actions and all kinds of hypermedia stuff. So if I just say just hello world, if I change something in my code, then actually under the hood, it does. This is now how I ran it, actually just with a shell script, because that's easy to set up. And if I then just invoke this endpoint again, it will already show the change here, right? So, that's what a lot of people have shown already, right? Do hello world and then change the constant and then, reload and you see the change. But here, this is actually happening inside a Docker container. So this uses the remote dev mode that connects with this running coffee shop here, this one, that runs inside there. And you can then just connect from the outside. And also, I actually didn't test this recently, but it should work. You should be able to attach to process, run locally. You should be able to debug it locally. Nope. Connection reset, local host. Let me just check. Maybe the port is blocked. But always have a fallback. I actually recorded a video about that as well. So what happens, you just have to set up that debug port correctly. That remote dev also listens for a debug, of course, so you can actually debug into your remotely running Quarkus application. So whether it's in a container or somewhere else, which is then also pretty cool, because then you can just see what's happening here. So this is especially helpful for more complex setups. The way how I usually run this is actually, it looks very pragmatic. Somewhat here, I actually run it as bash scripts. Why? They're just the fastest way to start up, Docker containers. I know people who say, well, you should do like cat test containers, you should do Docker Compose or something else. But for me, literally three times Docker run is the easiest thing to run that. With actually the remote dev mode, that's a little bit more challenging because now this is one feedback I have already for the Quarkus folks. And before, I think it was version 1.6, this was a little bit, well, in my case, it was actually easier, I would say, but it was maybe more low level. So the remote dev mode was built in a different way. And I think, let me now check before I did the update. Yeah, this first video actually used it in a different way. So I had actually a Docker container that was running Maven, and then the Maven, the remote container would start up this remote dev mode. Now this is actually easier. So the build perspective is easier to put together, but you just have to be sure that you set the correct properties. So this is what I was struggling with. You have a different package type that you need, and for that reason, I actually also modified the Docker file that I'm using here to just a different one, which for me, again, is also easier. Then I can swap the JVM and use whatever I like here. And then this works that you say locally now, remote dev, please connect to this this application here. And actually, it also uses the same, like URL that you would use to access your application. And then, set the correct properties. You can also do this with -d inline in Maven, and then this works. And folks, please comment on it. I don't know if that's the best way to go actually, but this worked for me in this rather complex setup where we have multiple containers, and I can have the connection locally to what I want to do there.
I need to check because I know this. So just for those who might have used this before, what we had is we not say automatically, but we automatically detected if you run the build inside. You had to have Maven and stuff inside the container.
Yes,
to do
exactly.
it. And that was the thing we wanted to
avoid
or reduce the need for. But I thought it was made in a way so you don't have to package the initial one as a mutable jar, and it'll just do it on the fly. But maybe I'm wrong.
No.
You have to do it. Yeah. Okay. So we wanted to get to a point where we could use the same build setup, except for maybe a single flag. And you didn't have to have a different container or a different setup, because some people with production, they will not have Maven and Gradle and whatever in there. So that was that change, and that's the mutable jar makes it just so we can the remote dev can that's the wrong word. Efficiently pick up the changes and apply them like while Quarkus runs. And that actually, we probably should get that. It sounds like it's not hard to get, but we probably could document that better, I think. It should. Well, the idea is it should be easier to do than the old one.
Yeah,
and it works in all cases, right? Or in more cases than the old one did.
Yes, I'm pretty sure about that. And I think if you start from a blank space, then this is actually easier, right? Because it's not confusing that you need Maven being packed up in Docker or something like that.
Yes.
I think from my perspective, if you had it working in a different way before, then it was just confusing, because I think the issue was the original one that once you switch to 1.6 or something, it actually it failed with an error saying like, oh, you now need to do this package type or something like that.
Yeah, we had to have a hard break.
Didn't start anymore.
Yes, yeah, that is true. That's true.
And that was just, from that perspective, I was like, oh, why? It worked before. Like, why don't you let me run it again? But coming from that perspective, it definitely makes sense. I mean, I see the point, and it's actually nicer that you don't have to, put your Maven into a Docker.
Yeah.
So that's quite nice. Cool. And just in general, that this works actually by running locally. This is pretty cool. And so I've been showing this in some presentations as well, and I've been using it myself a lot. Which actually, if for people watching, if you think it through, because now if you do such a setup with, assuming this is now the three setup, the setup with my 3 containers, then you can actually get to this point where you have this really fast feedback. Because now I run this actually with a perspective of system tests. So now what you can do, you have this set up this environment running locally, you have it up and running, and you can just go, and what I did, go to curl localhost. And now the cool thing is you can actually go and say, well, I have a system test, like a test that connects to my running application. And in this case, we'll just create some coffee or whatever. And you can go and just run this very quickly, because it will just go to that application that is already running. Let me just start this inside the IDE. And then it will just, go and connect to it and verify whether the whole thing is working. So you get a super fast feedback on your system test environment as well, because, the whole thing is already running. And then if you change something on a production code, you can quickly change it, and within 1 or 2 seconds, you get a response. Or if you, change something on your tests, that also just runs very quickly, because my tests just connect to the system that is already running. And then you also get the feedback in, 2 seconds or whatever. So this is actually pretty cool, because, just to enable you to stay in this development flow experience. So this is typically what I'm doing. I just keep it open, like you see here, and I just keep coding. And that's also the cool thing about this development mode. I think you just, keep typing, and it fails, compile error, and at some point it will work again, and then it just picks it up, restarts, and there you go. So this is actually very fast feedback. I just,
and the nice thing is that the same thing you've done here, well, you could do local, like without Docker, and now you have Docker, and you could also use. You could, if you wanted to, let's say that was that the mocking system you had. Maybe you need to test against a running in Kubernetes or some other system. That the same development model can be applied.
Yeah,
be a bit slower because you have to go with a wire, but
yes.
Still you can do it. So
yes, exactly. I mean, if it's an easier setup, then definitely that's possible on a code level. Just from my experience, the harder it is to set up a more complex environment where you actually have multiple things, and then typically you will need to restart stuff all the time. So this is actually the cool thing, that you can say, okay, this development mode also works in a remote way in containers. And then you can just
so one thing that we're actually doing at the moment, we have a feature, I think, on the Quarkus main list called discussed as what's it called,
FDB.
And because we had this use case where, hey, I want to test with a database, and we tell people, well, use H2 or some in-memory thing, and then you off to the races, right? But we came up with this, or Stuart came up with the idea of, well, if you just say, if there's no configuration for a database, but you have stated, like you have a dependency on Postgres or MySQL, we will actually use test containers to start it up for you, and then inject the settings for you. So that means that any container database stuff, the Postgres, MySQL, DB2, Oracle, etc. It's not in there yet. It's going to be in 1.12 or 1.13, depending on what we get done. But then you don't have to do the setup here. You had, like you said, you had this script with your 3 or 2 containers.
Right.
But you can still do it. Like your use case is not going to go away. It's perfectly valid. But it's one of the things we have always we have all the information. Like Quarkus actually knows what database you're running against, and because we put it into the build. So now we just integrate with test containers this way that there's no setup for it. It just works. The only requirement is you have Docker. And if you don't have Docker, well, you can't do this anyway. You'll just run locally. And it works surprisingly nice. It's just there's literally no setup. Like you don't even need to know there's a test container running.
And if you want to opt out, you just configure your URL, database URL, and then
we don't stop the container. Yeah. So
and
I hope
is this actually tangled with the life cycle of the test, or the life cycle of the development mode application, or something like that?
It would. I think
it's the development mode. So
but also test, right? That was what.
Yeah, it does work in test too as well.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. Because what I always tell everybody who wants to listen is to please separate the life cycles of the test from the test environment. Because for simple setups, it's nice if your test already starts up the whole test environment, but actually for more complex things you don't want that, because then you get slower in the overall time, because for each and every test run you actually have to restart it. Although Quarkus is super fast and you can reuse it and things like that, but you actually will lose a few seconds overall over time if you do it long enough. Whereas on the opposite, if you can have a development setup, like either shell scripts, what I did, or if you just say do the dev mode once, and then this
Yeah.
keeps it up and running, and say, okay, now just rerun it, the test and stuff like that.
Okay, you want to run the same tests against the same database. Sorry, multiple tests against the same database.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the VM, but like multiple VM restarts.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that one, I think this would not cover. Here you would have to start, because Quarkus lifecycle doesn't start before you run the first test, as far as I know.
Mm-hmm. But if it's connected to the dev mode, wouldn't that just work if you say Quarkus dev, and then if it doesn't find a database, it starts at one?
So that will be a good, yeah. As I said, it just started last week, so that would be good.
Mm-hmm.
I think the dev mode starts one, but it would actually be interesting if you could find a way of keeping them around. Yeah, it's a good point. But
we could keep them around if we wanted to.
Yeah, but we just also have to.
Just in general, if that makes sense, then it would be more like a local development environment in general, because you can even use it for like your own testing rather than just test cases, but just say, hey, run Quarkus dev. I'm gonna code now for 2 hours and just keep it running the whole time, including a database that you just set up freshly, and that might be.
Yeah, I think we have to see, because I think as soon as you start living outside the life cycle, then it might be easier to do something like what you're doing, right? The one thing.
So that's the question, what's actually easier for. So for me, the thing is also because I do a lot of Docker, and I'm on Linux, so it's always very easy just to start up the whole thing. And even if you need to map in some volumes, that's actually very easy if you're on a Linux kernel in general. And then for me, that's a pragmatic choice.
Cool. So we have a question here that is somewhat related.
Yeah.
And it says, can we have a JUnit test annotated with Quarkus test run against the containerized Quarkus app as shown here? Should avoid starting the whole app itself for testing. Also cool for native.
So I have an opinion. I have a very strong opinion on that. I can answer it from my perspective.
Sure. Go ahead.
So the reason why I actually also was, I think, putting this in an issue very at the beginning, why I'm not a big fan of this Quarkus test. And actually, if somebody watching is in the Spring world, or back then it was Achillean or whatever, like it's always the same. You have a test that kind of fires up either your application or a somewhat simulated application with some parts of it or whatever, or a DI container, which I actually almost never use or almost never advocate, for the whole reason of the turnaround times. Because even if you have a single test run where Quarkus can do that, where you just reuse the application, so you start it up once for the whole test run, then run your 100 tests and tear it down again, it's actually still less or slower turnaround compared to what I just did. If you have an environment that keeps you keep up and running the whole time, and then you can just very quickly rerun your test, and you get actually the feedback instantly. Because what I'm doing here is I just connect to a URL, and the whole thing is still running, and then I get the feedback much faster. So in general, I would actually avoid having tests that trying to play around with the test environment in general. So whether, it's very convenient with this Quarkus test, it's, same idea with test containers and all that, just for the reason of basically the quick turnaround. So I would keep them separated. And as for the question of the DI container, to say, well, you can mock things there and, on a code level test, which is kind of convenient, but then I would argue, well, actually, you need to test the whole thing. If you do some business use case tests, you actually need to test them in a properly running environment, like a properly running container or something like that anyway, because there might be some small differences in, your configuration or, whatever. So you need to test them later on anyway. So it doesn't bring you much actually to go for that approach. With very, very few exceptions to just, sometimes you need have some, I don't know, something like CDI extension type of things that you then want to test and just get faster feedback. But actually with Quarkus, since it starts up so fast, I would just, always locally test either in development mode and keep the whole thing up and running, or then have something like this where you have a dedicated test environment that you fire up once and then you keep it running. So for me,
because I'm struggling to see what he's after that we don't have. Like, When
Okay.
you run native test, you're running basically black box test.
Okay.
What
So
you're doing here is the same thing, right?
Here is where I want to add what we'll also hopefully have in 113. It's related to the question. So, like Sebastian said, when you start a Quarkus test, you basically run the test and the application in the same JVM, and the test can sort of play around with the actual application and change it, mock stuff and stuff like that, which you may or may not want to do. I tend to agree with Sebastian there. So what we'll likely have in 113 is the notion of the Quarkus integration test. And what that is basically once you've built either the native image or the container or the jar, whatever your final artifact is, the test will launch that and simply in launch that in a separate process. So even if it's a jar, it'll start Java minus jar. If it's a container that you've built, it will run like Docker run. If it's a native image, it will run the native. And then it will interact with the application just over HTTP, right? So it's a different process. So in that case, even if you've created a container based like on our jib extension and have tried to use have created a container with the native application, then from the testing perspective, the Quarkus integration test will be the same thing, right? You just use Quarkus integration test and you hit the application with like HTTP traffic or whatever. So I think that's what the question refers to. So basically, it's taking what we have with @native image test to make it more general.
Yeah, that was what I was hearing. Yeah. So, but yeah, that's cool. So, hope that helps you, Dan.
Yeah, I see the point. I still am actually a fan to keep these things separate from a lifecycle perspective. So if it would be there individually, for example, so I've been playing around with test containers that you can actually have a totally separate, not only a separate Java process to start up the whole thing, but also control that process, individually, that you can say, okay, now please start the environment, and then I'm in my, coding workflow. Which then is, for me, kind of the benefit to, keep that running forever during your development session and just get the fast feedback anyway. And if then, it makes it a little bit more convenient to say, oh, check if it's already running, if not, and start it or whatever, but otherwise leave it alone, then, that could be a little bit easier. Yeah. Interesting. So yeah, but that's basically what I do with this setup. So this is the first thing that I wanted to show, especially with some more complex setups with this development experience, which I think is actually pretty cool, just from that matter. And well, what else? Coming back from a EE perspective, so where I started out, I mean, first of all, what I really loved about Quarkus was that it actually supports these known APIs, right? Like, if you come from Java EE, Jakarta EE, it supports, of course, JAX-RS, CDI, and all of that stuff. So from that perspective, it's not many new surprises if you are in this, or if you come from that world. In the same way, I like how it is so somewhat pragmatic. So I actually recorded also a video about some, additional, or I don't know how to call them. I called them additional non-standard CDI features, where there's also, documentation side for Quarkus. So, there are many examples. For example, you have some, I would call syntactical sugar that you can inject actually without inject if there is another qualifier present and things like that. So in microprofile, you can just say add config property, and small of these things where it's not really surprises. So it's just a nice syntactical sugar. But also what I like about how, these things are handled, and I will show you another example in a second, is that it's somewhat, pragmatic balance between being opinionated but not too opinionated, if that makes sense, right? So it's not just you have to follow this way, but you're still flexible, right? So if you say, hey, this is the somewhat recommended approach because it saves you some code or whatever, but if you don't want to go for that approach, or if you can't for some reason, or maybe you do some type of migration from another project, from a different technology, then it's still it still offers you more or some flexibility use a few things in a different way, which I actually like, because for what it's worth, I really appreciate flexibility for real world projects in general, because chances are that your real world project is not just the newest simple hello world examples, but actually you have a lot of nasty things out there, and then if you're more flexible how to integrate them, that's actually very, very helpful. So for example, what I was using, so in the beginning I was a little bit skeptical about it, about the persistence with Panache. So there's a nice
like
guides about that as well, where you do this, that's still JPA at entity and at table, and then you have Panache entity base, or Panache entity, depends on how you want to handle the at ID. And then, of course, these public fields with, if you're an old school Java developer, you're like, oh, what's that? You should not, this must not be public. Of course, it has to be private and getters and setters, right? That's the golden rule, somewhat. But it's actually, once you get used to it, that you then also can say something like coffee order.list all, which is actually, of course, a static method that comes from Panache entity base, which at first, looks a little bit weird, and unused to us developers, as Java developers, similar to active records and something like that. But it's actually very helpful, right? It's once you get, past this point of resistance, then especially for these entities, it's just, a very pragmatic, straightforward way where a lot of these things are already supported that you probably need to do. So this is kind of cool. But to my point that I mentioned before, you can also, I think I actually don't have an example, Quarkus guides. You can also do something like a Panache repository, where then this is more the, the way how we would be used to program in EE, like you inject something that's let me just persistence. No, Panache probably, yeah. Where you can actually inject a repository that then lists whatever you want to do in your CDI beans, and your entities. I'm just looking while I'm talking here, and then your entities won't be touched. So for example, if you then say I want something like a person or coffee order repository, then this is a CDI bean that then you could just inject and use here, where you have the benefit that then your JPA entities just look plain old like you used to, which sometimes might be helpful. For example, if you have a more complex hierarchy of things, of your domain models, of your domain entities, where for some reason, you're just not able to include another base class, for example, or, you don't want that or whatever, or your code comes from somewhere else. And then, what I mentioned about flexibility, you're still flexible to say, okay, never mind if that approach doesn't work for you, or you didn't get past the, coding guidelines with your architect to make this public, or, include a base class. Then you can still go for this approach and use the repository, which also I think is actually a very clean and nice approach, by the way, as well. So, I think there's another example where there's just a nice pragmatic balance between all of these, things that you can use in Quarkus, but you don't have to. And still, of course, if you still use the plain JPA with Entity Manager, that also works as well, which is also a nice perspective for somewhat migration projects, or if you still have some code that uses that, of course, this works also. So I think this is a nice balance how to integrate that. And of course, just try it out if you want to get familiar with this new API.
Yeah, I had the same challenge when I got in. I was like, no, you don't extend the framework thing in your bean. I'm like, what? But then I had a, I can't remember if it involved beer or something, but I remember having a talk to Steph about this. Mm-hmm. And he explained well, first of all, he liked it from his use case on, but then when I saw I can do the external service stuff, I'm like, okay, great, then I can still do what I'm used to. But his point was actually, well, as you're doing more and more microservices, you have less and less code that gets affected by this, and you have duplicated of those classes anyway. And like a good practice is, even if you want to share the same data, you don't share the same implementation, so your those teams can move. Right. And then all those rules we have of why we have to have public getter setters just doesn't apply anymore, because now it's just that individual project. You don't affect 10, 20 other subprojects, and therefore, the whole thing, then you save a lot of time, and a lot of code. So it's just it's a different world now.
No, exactly. Yeah. And as you mentioned as well, if people are just hesitant, then just tell them, hey, you go for this approach, you can go for that as well. And then maybe they try out and they maybe see, okay, actually, by the way, it's not too bad anyway. So maybe then are also kind of tempted to go for that approach.
So that's there. Cool. All right.
So this is also a very nice and pragmatic thing. Something else that I actually was using a few times, Quarkus Qute, was this one, the templating engine, where at first I also wasn't, too sure. But then quite quickly I saw that this is actually super powerful for all kinds of enterprise projects, or all kinds of actually things that you can run in the internet. Because quite often I just if we have some Quarkus application that just serves static files, I know it's a lot of overkill, but sometimes you can actually get rid of a lot of other like boilerplate things by just running everything in one Java application that also serves some templates or serves some static files or whatever. So this templating engine works actually really, really well. I was first using it. Oh, it's still experimental. Okay.
So Sebastian, can we just, because we actually have a question that is related to this.
Please,
where was it good? Yeah, so this was Hassan who asked that, hey, the incubation header is at the top of some plugins. Hardening our work. Would be nice to know when they'll be deemed production ready. So I think he's talking about ABS, Lambda, and the funky stuff. And in this case, we have the Qute one. So just for those who don't know, we categorize our extensions, because we do releases very often, and we don't want to be limited to semantic version kind of thing. So we have this mark on things that, hey, there's some API here that might be breaking or changing. So just to take the funky case. So the funky case, I think they are still not in a full stabilized thing, but I do think I've had that question 3 or 4 times last month now. So I think it's time for us to go and review the list and see which ones we can move forward. So to Hassan, I can't answer on top of the head because it's been a while since I looked at them, but it's one of the things we probably should look at in the coming weeks and months to get clear. And the Qute one here, I saw that myself actually, because and I think Martin, who does most of the Qute stuff, he said that he would try and get it. There's one API change he wanted to do, but I want to get that one off experimental, because we've literally used Qute everywhere now. So so it needs to. It's experimental because of upcoming API change, but I think we that one is as production ready as everything else, because it's in core of Quarkus now.
Yeah, that's a good background. I mean, I can also answer that question a little bit from my project view, because I very often got the question to all kinds of technologies like, hey, is it production ready? And I would sometimes just say, by the way, what is production ready? Or in other terms, actually nothing is production ready. Everything can break tomorrow. So in other words, you have to have an approach how to actually test things in whatever you're doing anyway, right? Because chances are, if you use some things you might rely on some bug that actually gets later on fixed and then breaks your stuff or whatever. So there is no way around for you to have a proper system and integration test for whatever you do, right? And then it doesn't matter how experimental or early feature something is, if actually it works and you have to rely with tests, or you have to verify that it works, then go and use it. Right?
What you're actually telling us is we should keep those warnings here, because that forces people to do it. Because you remove the hey, then you go okay, great, it's verified. We don't have to test anymore. So
exactly, and that's exactly the point. To say, oh, now it's production ready. Okay, thank you. Now I don't have to test it. No, because it's still your code and that's your project. You want to see that tons of things that break your project. So. Just to answer the question, test it properly, and if it's properly tested, why not use it? Whatever the label is. And I think also that's what people see now more and more, that this these whole things of, is it production ready? Is it officially supported? What does that even mean, right? Because later on, when you're there and you're facing a problem, you have to fix it anyway. It doesn't matter if there's a super shiny, expensive label of being production ready or not on your technology. Yeah. If it works, it works. So that's my point of view on that.
All right,
and
let's go.
Yeah, for Qute, I can actually say I've also been using it for a long time in production now, and just in general, it's actually a very nice way of integrating, well, all kinds of things. So, you can use these templates for all kinds of stuff, but I typically see it from this action-based MVC for web applications. So basically, you do a request to something that will render HTML, and that gets rendered on the server side, and, like in plain old JSPs, which are actually still also, very valid technology. So I got asked quite often, like, hey, should we still go for such an approach? That's kind of like 2000 and something. But actually, server-side rendering is, very valid, very modern, very good approach to just render whatever you want to show to your users and have them fully rendered HTML being shipped to the user. Where this is actually a nice integration, especially with REST-Easy and JAX-RS. So I've actually coded a similar approach sometimes with some hacky versions myself in the past, when this, of course, was not a thing, but then used JAX-RS to either forward it to something like a template engine, or there's a Jakarta MVC kind of standard with something similar to MVC, to Spring MVC controllers. Then I think they're called @controller, with a very similar thing that just you forward it to some sort of template. But this integration I really like here with this Qute approach. So you have this template which gets rendered to a template instance, and then actually whatever you want to render here, you can render HTML. We've also done it with emails, something like that. Anything that is just a templated approach, that then here integrates nicely, that it can render to a template instance. You can say produces text plain or HTML, and then you actually have a very straightforward action-based MVC web application. And from my perspective, this works really well. At first, means like 1.5 years ago, something, had some issues, some minor issues with the templating, with some things. If I think at some point I put in an issue with some nested expressions, which now also is fixed a while ago. All of these expressions work really well. So, my first thoughts actually were that, the person who wrote this actually thought about, all of the cases that you have when you typically do some templating, right? Like, what about all of these loops? And then, check for some, I don't know, comma that you would append if you do a loop and just print something, and, something like that. So all of these things work really well. And yeah, I actually like the technology a lot. So it's very, pragmatic as well. And if you just don't include any other or have any other templating engine already, then this is actually a very straightforward way to just say, if you need to render some HTML at some point in your web app, this is a very easy approach.
Have you benefited from the static compilation that we do? That if you refer to a property that is wrong, that it doesn't exist, then it will fail at build time or at the render time with like informative error messages rather than just something's written wrong.
Yes, I've seen that when coding it. Yeah.
Because that's the thing that well, first of all, I think Martin will be happy to hear that you say that the guy who made it has thought about it, because I know he has. And I know that in the beginning there were some syntax issues that got fixed very fast, and there was like quoting was another thing we had, was the like when you start generating JSON, which is a bit problematic because the syntax of Qute is using curly braces, which disturbs. But we found a very good way of doing it. Like I think it's like if there's a space between the curly brace and the string, then it will be ignored.
I had that as well, actually, in HTML. Yeah, but it only takes it when
And but it means that you can basically we started using it for code generation of some Java code and stuff, and it's like, oh, this is painful. So, but now it's fixed. Like it's fairly good at escaping stuff. You can use it for anything, even though the Qute was was intended mainly for HTML and email and that kind of thing. But now it's like generically useful. But the thing we also get about Qute is like, why are we making a new template engine? And just for those who don't know, it's not because we didn't want to use others, just that the others did not. First of all, they were not async, and if you were async, then you didn't have these compile safety things that we wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
That we actually have the build information, so why not fail earlier? And then I think those.
And then most of them, they didn't work in native, right?
Oh, sorry, yeah,
huge thing. Yeah,
that was the third one. Yeah, they didn't work in GraalVM unless you did like all kind of registration, all kind of workarounds. So in Quarkus, so you can use Qute, by the way, standalone as a library for any kind like free mark or velocity or what's the string? The other one you can too. But when you're in Quarkus, Quarkus and Qute plays together, and they know about the types they are using.
Mm-hmm.
So when you refer to an entity in a template that Quarkus knows during build time, Quarkus takes care of all the native magic, all the GraalVM stuff. Whereas if you use something else, then you have to manually register it, and the thing is, you don't know, so you might actually register stuff you don't need to register and add to the size of the image, that kind of thing. So it's quite. It took me actually a while to realize the power of this thing, but it enables a lot of things that are just impossible.
It's one of those things that you actually have to see it done in order to appreciate it.
Yeah, especially, I mean, if you would think about the comparison or the alternative, right? Because, most people would not think about, well, does it work with native? And then like, oh, okay, we can't use this and that, right? I mean, it's actually, I would say it's a very nice compliment if people just think about the technology and it works so well, or it seems so easy to use that it's just like, why is this even there, right? It should be obvious because it works just seamlessly, or kind of, or at least in comparison, if you would have to solve all of these things yourself. I mean, let alone the native compilation or all of these syntax issues and all these things. So I think that's it's very valid technology to have.
Yes, I saw Bita saying here, want to maintain Qute extension as part of core since it still sounds a bit peripheral. Hopefully, I'm using it internally. So if that is to us, then no, we are definitely using it internally.
We want to use our own stuff, because if we don't use our own stuff, then how do we know that it's actually useful?
And if you go, last week we talked about, was it last week? I forgot, about dev mode, the new dev UI mode. It's actually using Qute behind the scenes to do the rendering. Or not even any extension we want to do in
set
dev
up
mode.
The pages, yeah,
it's done in Qute. So yeah, I do want to get that. It is a core part of Quarkus. It's an intrinsic part of delivering something in an enterprise fashion.
Yeah, like Sebastian said, I mean, you don't. Not every case is a headless microservice, right? You have a lot of use cases where it just makes sense to have a whole thing delivered in one go. And why make people jump through hoops to get that?
Yeah, but even in a microservice, like any microservice that serves out some JSON where you want to, or an email or that kind of thing, it's just still relevant. So yeah. By the way, I need to answer this one because it just came up. I don't know if he's trolling or what. Mike says, "Will Quarkus also move to SSLP license in the future?" I'll no, never. So yeah, I don't like.
Another question I actually have: where does the name come from? Who came up with
which
the name
one?
Qute.
It's Quarkus templating engine. So.
Yeah.
It's
an
QU for Quarkus T templating engine. So but it was smart. I don't know who came up with it. Probably Mark.
Yeah.
They justified the name afterwards.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
So no. And the thing is, you also see one of the things we're trying to do is to make sure you can express stuff statically. So that's why we have this add native, this little. I'm not sure if it's in the doc here, but you can. Create this class that lists the types. And that's where we we're hitting the limits of Java. So we're waiting for records to be more. Then we can use that a bit better. But we're pushing the limits of what can be done statically, testing the dynamic templates. So that's what we do. Okay. And yeah, this just for Mike. So like this, he's probably referring to Elasticsearch to the SSPL license, which is all the hype in the media right now. But no, we won't, because that's not an open source license. We want to make sure that the source codes and stuff we do can be used by anyone, not just Red Hat. So yeah, very much no to that one.
Yeah, no need to worry about that.
No, that'll be that.
Nice.
Okay. Anything else, Sebastian?
Yeah, that's pretty much it for Qute. Something else, I mean, that's of course true for the whole Quarkus ecosystem, is basically the build time optimization, which solves a lot of issues. Actually, if you think about it, I mean, now we're already kind of used to that, but for folks maybe who are new to this, and or compare it to the world where you just build an artifact and then at runtime you actually have to go and collect all of your information. So this is, I think, actually, for a number of reasons, the biggest killer feature of Quarkus, that you trying to do all of that work at build time, and yet, at least for the first time when I used it, I was really surprised how fast it is, right? Like, especially in comparison, that it just, like for, some a medium-sized application, like just a few seconds, literally, to build up everything that you would need. And I'm not even talking about the native mode, because this quite often when I talk to developers, get somewhat, I wouldn't say confused, but that they make the equivalent that Quarkus is or has to be native, which I say from my perspective, actually, no, that's not true at all. Of course, you can go native, and we know all of that. But for me, this is not even the biggest point. But for me, the point is actually the build time optimization, because then you always win. You always get these benefits, even and especially if you run in JVM mode, which is actually what all of my projects are doing. So all of the things I'm building are actually not using the native mode at all. I always run JVM mode. Sometimes I swap the JVM to OpenJ9 or something like that. For you get the benefit of course, some resource consumption. So it's actually much smaller, because you can throw away a lot of stuff, and it starts up still faster, or fast enough. And still you have the benefits of the thin deployment artifacts and thin layering, which I also really loved when I tried it out the first time, that I say, oh, actually this works with my approach that I was advocating for years for people who use containers, that you just should make sure that your the diffs of your container images are small. So for me, it never mattered if your image is, a few hundred megabyte. I don't care, because if you do a Docker build or transfer, you only transfer the things that are changed. And now if you have, a single file, like a binary or, a Spring application that just is, megabytes, then you always have to transfer megabytes around, which doesn't really make sense. And this is, just supported out of the box if you use Quarkus in JVM mode. And, you still get all of the benefits from the build time operations. So
Yeah,
I think this is actually, very nice, pretty much sweet spot of enterprise Java, I would say, that you don't have to do this at runtime, but it gets built at build time, and still you can use basically best of both worlds somewhat.
Yeah, and it's one of those. It took me a while to actually realize that all the stuff we do for native is not for native's fault. Like that's a size nice benefit.
It's an enabler of native, but it has so many benefits,
like
even if native didn't even exist, right?
Yeah. That's the thing, is like what makes Quarkus fast, like both for production startups and dev mode, is all the stuff we do at build time. And yeah, I'm like you. I'm also like, oh, why can it do that fast? But that's because it doesn't, when it runs a build, it doesn't have to have the constraints of the VM. So we can access the bytecode on disk faster. We don't have to verify and all other stuff to just kind of slow things down for good reasons in production. But during build, we can take a little bit of liberties. So we actually got a few questions that I think we can fill up the last of the time here. What was the... It says like about time when it comes to Java, are you guys waiting for Garage Java 16 before trying it out? And she's referring to Java. He actually meant Java 15 because he wants to have, or he wants to have text blocks.
Well, to answer this,
I think it works.
No, Quarkus always works with the latest Java. right? We always
Yeah.
test with 8, 11, and the latest Java. So now the latest, the latest actual production release, right? So now we're testing with 15. When 16 is released, we'll start testing with 16.
Yeah.
But we do do some EA testing as well with pre-release Javas,
Yeah.
and they always work. I mean, even if it doesn't work, we fix it really quickly, but there's no reason why it shouldn't work.
But it's just Quarkus on Java 15 we know works in Java VM mode.
Right.
But for Graal VM native, there might be some limitation. I don't know but I'm not sure if we've tested that combination.
But is there a Graal VM 15?
But that's
release?
what Bataille is referring to. Are you waiting for that thing? I said, like, for native, yes, we are waiting on Graal VM to release. But we just so you know, we actually have a team working with the Graal VM team the OpenDDK team to make sure we can do these things. So no, we're not waiting for Quarkus can run in VM mode on newer versions. Yes, the native mode might be waiting because of some quirk there. But if you are okay, you are in Quarkus without native mode, then you can. And then I think Eve Chen is saying, what makes Quarkus Kubernetes native? Is this just container native or something specific for Kubernetes?
Well, there's a lot of Kubernetes specific stuff, right?
Yeah. Go
ahead. No, go ahead.
I'll just say so native here again is an older term. Just making sure this doesn't refer to native images like native executables. It just refers to that. Hey, we want to make sure Quarkus works really well in container-based development, and especially Kubernetes. What does that mean? That means that yes, we have native images for reducing the size. We are okay to put stuff at build time because we believe you want to have smaller images and smaller startup times. But also we are making sure that when you're running in Kubernetes, stuff is just kind of taken care of. Like if you want to have health endpoint and metrics, you just add an extension to say you want it, and then we set it up, and we will generate the deployment descriptors for you. You can still do that manually. What else is there? We make sure that we have a very easy deployment of anything to plain Kubernetes, to OpenShift, etc. Is anything I'm missing here, Joris? Dev mode is there. It works. We know it works we make sure it works there.
Yeah.
We have.
So there's stuff that will happen in the future. More stuff that will happen in the future. Regarding service binding and stuff like that, but that's kind of advanced for most people. But
config map and secrets are like
we can read those automatically. I mean, most of the stuff. Well, actually, I can't think of anything that a developer that actually interacting with Kubernetes would need that we don't have. And if there is something, I'd love to hear about it so we can add it.
That's also my perspective, because that it's native or that it's just well supported doesn't have to mean that you add a bunch of features. It just means it's nice already if it just doesn't get in the way, right? If you say what you said about health checks and things like that, if you could just easily either add something, or at least that it's not super complicated to say I want to run it in Kubernetes, right? So because all of these things are actually supporting it very well, right? Or if you think about microprofile config and just say, well, just use the config from some environment variable, and then quite quickly in Kubernetes deployments, you can add those. So this already is a big, plus without thinking about some specific features that one have to use, right? So if it just doesn't get in the way, if you compare it with, especially with some other technology, right? I think that is already, an advantage in its own, somewhat. So it just works really well. I mean, I can confer it. I was using it from day one with Kubernetes, and it just works really well in containerized environments.
Yeah, and the same thing as we're still not fully there, but we're trying to make sure that you can literally get started with it without having to install. Like, you don't have to know about the container. Or right now, the only thing you have to install is kubectl. So you have to log in, which you need to the cluster, which you need kubectl for. But otherwise, everything else is taken care of. Well, we can take care of it. We're not forcing you, but
that's the right way to put it. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So
You don't want to force people.
Oh, and Thomas is also adding that. Oh, sorry, no.
Yeah, well, I think he's kind of the same as I said that doing this stuff at build time makes it just easier to work in an immutable container environment.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's like the use. The thing we do the most is like the use case we do in Quarkus. We want to make sure that they actually work in a container native environment. Whereas if you actually don't have that mindset, you might choose another option that will work great on your desktop or in a bare metal server. But when you get to container native, like, oh, that's not there. One of the reasons why we don't have like a managed UI or managed API, because we believe that's better done by the system that's doing your container management. Like,
yeah, that stuff is all moved to the platform, so it doesn't make sense for us to do it again.
Okay, we have one. Let's take one more before we have a hard stop here. Inject more config inside a config provider somehow, and I want to do that to run unit tests with extend with. Is that possible? That's your markable test thing, right? Your
well, I would need to see specifics of what this. So yeah, just ping me on Zulip, and we can figure this out, because
just thinking it through, I think it's definitely possible with Quarkus test, right? Because then on your test scope, you could add something like a bean that then just tinkers with your configuration.
Yeah,
but the other question is if that makes sense, actually, the whole approach on its own. But that's the topic we were talking about before.
Doing Quarkus test, you can set up your own specific configuration to test that specific thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wouldn't go and take a specific microprofile configuration. That seems to be a overkill. But yeah,
same.
Ping us on Zoom if you can answer more details. Great. Yes, and then I'll end on the line with what Sebastian says. Quarkus makes it easy for your application to be a good cloud-native citizen. That's
absolutely. Yes. That's a good punchline.
That's good. Cool. Thank you, Sebastian. And anyone who's on the line here, tweet questions to us with Quarkus Insights. We will pick them up. And otherwise, see you guys next week. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.